Podcast 88, Humor in the Stress. Podcast 88, Humor in the Stress, relates to the high degree of stress the providers of the psychological services encountered due to the lack of understanding of the new 1973 special education law. This lack of preparedness to implement the law produced a great deal of misunderstanding and fear in the minds of many teachers and administrators. The educational cooperatives service providers were the change agents for the school systems. The role of a change agent is a stressful one. We developed multiple ways to reduce that stress. Podcast 88, Humor in the Stress. As stated earlier, we knew that introducing major changes for the 7-member school systems of the educational cooperative was going to be stressful for both the school system educators and the cooperative's change agents. The changes the systems would have to make in implementing Tennessee's 1973 new special education laws were massive. The first year's extra funding was for identifying the children who met the state's criteria for having specific, defined disabilities that interfered with their experiencing the benefits the regular education programs offered to non-disabled children. Once the qualified disabled children were identified, the system had to design and implement an individualized education plan for each of those children. As the intervention plans were being implemented, the system had to systematically evaluate the effectiveness of the educational adjustments periodically throughout the school year. The systems were expected to implement the law fully and deliver the prescribed special education services recommended by the second school year, 1974 to 1975. The 1974-75 school year was also the year that the federal special education law came into the picture. That law was nearly identical to Tennessee's special education law. For the cooperative school systems, the 1973-74 school year also meant creating a new evaluation process using school psychological services on a systematic basis for the first time in their history. This was also the first time that the 7 school systems had ever been a member of an educational cooperative, sharing services provided across their boundaries on such a large scale. It was also the first time that all those providing school psychological services had ever delivered them to school systems, with the exception of myself as the director of those services. The issues that the senior graduate students in school psychology faced as graduate assistants delivering their professional services to the co-op school systems were gigantic. Naturally, they had doubts concerning their ability to properly perform the duties expected of a school psychologist. However, the special situations they were about to encounter were clearly unusual. The educators they were to work with did not understand what the special education law required of them, had never encountered the massive educational changes they were going to have to make to meet the requirements of the law, disagreed with those requirements as they learned about them, lacked the training needed to make the changes, did not understand what school psychological services were, had no idea as to what the educational cooperative was, and did not trust the motivations of the cooperative's other member school systems. Perhaps the most disturbing issue the graduate assistants would have to face was the stark reality that the state had not made available to the school systems the funds to employ enough school psychology providers to accomplish all of the evaluations, consultations, parent-teacher meetings, report writing, and reevaluations required of the service. There was no doubt in my mind that the graduate assistants were going to be successful. After all, most, if not all of them, were entering their third or fourth year of graduate school. At this stage of their doctoral programs, they had completed the vast majority of their required coursework and were focusing on preparing for comprehensive departmental exams and developing their dissertation research projects. Despite the professional training that far exceeded the state's requirements to be certified as a master's level school psychologist, I knew that the stresses placed upon these change agents were going to be high. The cooperative was going to have to develop stress-reducing strategies for the staff on a systematic basis. My first priority was to support them. Whenever any staff person requested a one-on-one meeting to discuss a situation in the schools, I would schedule the meeting as soon as possible. As approved by the cooperative's board of directors, the job description included being paid for attendance on the Friday afternoon staff meetings and time provided to attend at least one major professional conference a year. The agenda for the staff meetings included discussing any cases concerning the evaluation of a child, the support provided through the school system in meeting a child's needs, difficulties in working with personalities within the school setting, and a host of other issues that the staff needed to problem solve with the group. Developing the group support system was an important aspect in coping with the stress of the work environment. No one was expected to know how to address or solve all of the problems we would encounter. We had to tap into the collective wisdom of the group. The group had a massive amount of knowledge and problem-solving skills. Each one of them was highly intelligent intellectually, socially, and emotionally. As mentioned, they had all been extremely well trained in the state-of-the-art skills necessary to be functioning school psychologists. All of them thoroughly understood that they were going to be key change agents in furthering the development of educational services to children with and without disabilities. They had a solid understanding of the role of a change agent. In addition, they had already become their collective emotional support group during their joint experiences of being graduate students together. The wide diversity of backgrounds the individuals brought to the group prior to their graduate school days enhanced their creative problem-solving capabilities we could all draw upon for support. Among the group were several military veterans, former public school teachers, former mental health service providers, and others with equally valuable cultural experiences. Using humor to reduce stress was a natural response for me. I had used it while in the Army, while working in the inner city schools of St. Petersburg, Florida, and Knoxville, Tennessee, as well as during my 2 years at the university. During the 2 years at the university, some of my funny stunts had reached the level of being told so many times that their anchor to the truth had become rather thin. The new staff of graduate assistants with the co-op anticipated that we would find and share a humorous perspective for all our efforts in assisting children and teachers. Those early days of the cooperative found that the stress-reducing displays of humor were most apparent during Friday afternoon staff meetings, but not limited to that setting. Shortly after the graduate assistants and I had conducted the preschool in-services in all of our schools, we were encountering a great deal of hostility from angry and frightened teachers. We began our Friday afternoon staff meetings. Our collective offices were in a big classroom of an old school building. The school building had a hallway that led to an entrance to a relatively modern high school. It had a large walk-in cloak closet, much like my first and second grade classrooms in Granite City, Illinois, back in 1948. That closet was where all of us children hung our coats and left our bulky galoshes on rainy days. The cooperative staff cloakroom had a hanging-down light bulb with a long string attached to be pulled when you wanted the light on. Naturally, the ceilings inside the closet and classroom were unusually high. I wouldn't have been surprised if the building maintenance crew had told me that there was at least 16 feet between the floors and the ceiling. Standard school building folding tables were placed in a square arrangement in our former ancient classroom so that all of the staff could face each other during the staff meetings. During the meetings, incident after incident was provided of angry encounters the staff had had with various educators in their schools. I tried to calm the practitioners with comments to help them understand that the teachers were not angry with them as specific individuals. They were angry at the lack of preparedness their administrators had provided before they were expected to implement the new system. They were afraid that they could not maintain their current level of professional teaching while trying to implement new teaching strategies they did not know if they knew how to do. My words didn't relieve the staff's need to vent their frustrations. During one of those early staff meetings, our first opportunity to share in-group humor presented itself. As various staff members were interrupting each other, trying to express their dismay at the anger they encountered, something hit me on the side of my head. It was a paper wad. Looking in the direction that it had come from, I saw Frank, the former combat Marine, grinning at me as he wadded up another piece of paper, about to send one more missile my way. Quickly, I smiled back and ducked as the paper wad flew over the top of my head. As if I were throwing a grenade, I lobbed a ball of paper accurately at Frank's head. Looking up from his task of creating a new pile of ammo, he shouted, "Incoming!" This was war. Frank immediately tipped his table over as he hunched down behind it to launch his missiles as if they were mortar rounds. Instinctively responding, my table tipped to the floor. One of the other graduate assistants pushed a pile of ammo my way that he had been making. The extra ammo allowed me to return fire. Bam, bam, bam! All the other tables slammed to the floor to be used as protection from the paper wads coming from all directions. All of us were engaged in this battle. There were no sides. You just fired your paper wads at any and all targets. We laughed and howled until we nearly ran out of notepaper. Once the tables were returned to their proper positions, and we had collectively picked up most of the spent brass and ammo, we returned to our staff meeting agenda. The tension was gone. Collectively, we were supportive of the frustrations experienced by each of us, sympathetic to the needs of the educators to express their stress, and able to share insights on positive strategies for assisting the educators in addressing their concerns. At a later staff meeting, but still in the early part of the school year, Doug, a near all but dissertation graduate assistant, related this story. His rural school system had not assigned a school administrator to be the director of special education services. When he tried to establish whom he should report to about special education issues, he was passed from one administrator to another. None of them had an interest in acquiring information about the special education law or in telling anyone else what to do regarding it. More often than not, Doug was the person people in the system went to when they had a special education issue to resolve and to obtain explanatory information about it. Fortunately, Doug and all the other graduate assistants knew the law quite well. We were constantly covering it during staff meetings and staff training time. After a few weeks had passed, the school bus coordinator and custodian of all of the system's textbooks seemed to be the one administrator that Doug could persuade to make some decisions or to provide Doug with some positive direction for getting something done. Mr. Green was long in years within the system. Everyone knew him, and he seemed to know everyone. He constantly held the stub of a cigar in his hand. Most of the time it was not lit, but he would frequently move it to his mouth and suck on it as if he were really smoking it. Mr. Green had a particular fondness for one phrase that seemed to be used often with Doug or anyone else. That phrase would be followed by the name of the person Mr. Green was speaking to. With this information concerning Mr. Green, you can readily appreciate the story Doug told at a staff meeting concerning his seeking information from this supervisor. Doug's telling of the story went something like this. Well, I couldn't find any records of past psychological reports on children in the system. I went to the trailer temp building Mr. Green was in. He was there. His desk sat in the middle of rows of shelves stacked full of books. Taking his cigar out of his mouth and holding it suspended in front of his face, he gives me his "Hello, Douglas," greeting. "What do you need?" I can't find any records of psychological reports the system has on its kids. Do you know where they are? "Good, Douglas. That's good. Yeah, that's good," he says with a big grin and puts the cigar back in his mouth. "Do you know where they are?" I ask him again. Well, Douglas, why don't you go down there?" he says, waving his arm down an aisle of book-crammed shelves and pointing with the stub of his cigar. There's a cardboard box at the end that might have some of those." Sure enough, there on the floor was a cardboard box at the far end of the bookshelves full of file folders. Well, I picked up the first one from the file It had some sort of psychological report dated around 1945. The next one was dated in the early 1950s. There was no order to the time of the reports. They were just thrown into the box. Picking up a couple of boxes of the reports, I took them back to Mr. Green. Mr. Green, I found some in the box. Taking the stubby cigar from his mouth and looking at me, he said, "Good, huh? That's good. That's good, Douglas." "Is this it? Is this all there is?" You may have something there, Douglas. That's good, yeah, that's good. Okay, I'm going to start a whole new filing system for the school on this. Taking a couple of puffs on a cigar. Yeah, that's good, Douglas. Doug looked at all of us in great frustration. I immediately pretended to take a cigar from my mouth and loudly stated, "That's good, yeah, that's good, Douglas." My comments were echoed by several others as we all laughed together. Mr. Green's words were often used to bring humor into stressful times at staff meetings and in other places. Those words always brought warm smiles and knowing chuckles. Our humor was spontaneous. Seldom did we plan to do or say something to make us all laugh, or at least change our perspective. It just seemed to happen on its own, a product of the moment. For example, there had to have been some really frustrating account being told. Maybe it was about a school principal refusing to implement the recommendations of the professionals composing the child's multidisciplinary team's recommendation. At this point, let's speculate that the recommendations included allowing a teacher's aide trained in positive reinforcement be in the regular classroom with an autistic child. She is to assist him in maintaining a focus on correctly completing his lessons. It appeared that the refusal of the recommendations was a violation of special education law and destructive to the child. The issue before the provider of psychological services and the entire staff was what should be done to solve this dilemma. As the account of whatever problem was being told, anger was building and being expressed by the staff. Without thinking, I became inspired to climb onto the table, stomp across it, and jump onto the adjoining tables as I shouted in a loud authoritarian voice, trying to mimic a French accent, pretending to be Napoleon Bonaparte. "How dare the English stand in the ways of our pursuit of injustice for all? Off with their heads, and may they always be used as bowling balls." Then I'd calmly sit down in my chair and ask if anyone had a more positive way of helping the principal understand the needs of the child and why implementing the recommendations would be helpful to all concerned. Always after such a stunt as that, and the laughter had subsided, excellent ideas and suggestions would be articulated for resolving the conflicts. At some point during that first year, the host school system that was allowing the cooperative to use 2 of their former classrooms as office space directed its maintenance staff to build shelves along all 4 sides of the large walk-in closet. This allowed us to store various test kits, poster-making materials for in-services, and other relevant materials that were frequently used by the staff in an easily accessible space. The shelves were about 2 feet deep and 4 feet high with 5 or 6 levels of shelving. The very top shelf was around 5 feet from the ceiling. I keep repeating that the walk-in closet was a large one. Even when all the overhead lights in the classroom containing the closets were on, the interior of that closet was black. It was not possible to recognize what test kits you were picking up from the shelf unless you pulled the white string hanging down for the one bare light bulb in the space. Our host school system had also built us a sort of room divider structure. It carved out an office space that confidential discussions could be held in. Other cubicle spaces were built for the staff to use while leaving enough open space for staff meetings. The dividers were about 3 inches thick, made of rigid, stringy-like substance that had become cemented or glued together. The panels provided a solid wall that absorbed sound. This fabricated structure was stabilized by 2x4 braces at the floor level. The confidential office space panels were about 12 feet high. The sound-absorbing quality of those panels provided the privacy level needed by the staff and myself for various confidential discussions. Unless otherwise needed, that space served as my office. A large metal desk, file cabinets, and 2 chairs fit nicely into the space. The cubicles used for general purposes had wall panels that were about 6 feet tall. The cost of the material played a role in determining their size. All of the cubicle office spaces had a telephone. On several occasions, I would decide to have some fun with staff members by climbing into the shelves to surprise the first person entering the walk-in closet. On one occasion, I remember clearing out a shelf that was a little above eye level and fully reclining on it, trying to mimic the image of a reclining Buddha I had seen in a National Geographic magazine. When Barry walked in and pulled down on the hanging-down light bulb string and discovered me in the prone position, resting my head on my bent arm, he grinned at me. In his typically calm voice, he asked, "Jerry, what are you doing there?" In my best deep Buddha calming voice, I replied, "I am the reclining Buddha." That broke the calm within Barry. He began joyously laughing as I climbed down from the shelf. He helped me brush off the layers of dust I had accumulated, waiting for someone to enter. On another occasion, I decided to climb up to the very top shelf and sit Buddha style in the corner of it, facing the door to the storage space. It was a harder climb than I had anticipated, but I got there. The space was cramped. I kept bumping my head into the ceiling. My vision of being discovered by the first staff person entering the converted storage space was that as they looked up to grab the string that would turn on the lone light bulb, I would be discovered. We would both laugh, I would climb down, and we would be full of good cheer. That's not how it happened. One of the graduate assistants briskly walked into the closet. She was intent on looking on the opposite side of the shelving where the intelligence test kits are stored. Without looking up, she reached for and found that hanging down string and turned the light bulb on. She hadn't seen me. What should I do? As she reached for a test kit, I stated in my studied, quiet Buddha voice, "Not that one." Her hand froze. She looked to the left. She looked to the right. She moved her hand 2 test kits over and began to pick that one up. "Not that one either. Once again, her hand froze. For a few seconds, she just stood there, with her hand suspended. Then calmly, quietly, she walked out of the room. Laughing, I called out to her as I started climbing down the shelf to ground level. We both had a good laugh at my attempts at humor and the confusion she experienced. Later, she explained that she thought she was hearing the bleed over from a speaker connected to the school system's high school sound system. The high school was connected to this older building by a closed hallway. The other end of the older building's hallway held the administrative offices of the school system. Every once in a while, you could hear bits of announcements over the high school's speakers at our end of the old building. Her reasoning was sound. We still got some nice chuckles over my failed attempt to spread joy. There would be other times when it would occur to me to surprise a graduate assistant who, I thought, would appreciate the humor of my hiding in the chair well of my desk as he entered the office space. When he entered, I would speak from my hiding spot by saying something like, "Hi, I'm Jerry's talking desk. You can talk to me. I know everything he does. All of his files are in the desk drawers. I've held every one of his files." This scene produced some highly creative and funny exchanges. Not all of my behaviors and the staff's in sharing our laughter and valuing of each other occurred at the office. On one occasion, while driving towards Knoxville on a major 4-lane highway, I realized I was catching up to John's car. John Albright was working with the cooperative as the director of an environmental grant the cooperative had from the U.S. Office of Education, as he was completing his doctoral dissertation. I thought I would surprise him by tearing 2 eye holes into a brown paper bag, putting the bag over my head and driving up beside him, and then turning my head to face him. This was what the unknown comic wore when he appeared on the Gong Show, a popular TV show at that time. The basic format of the program was to have amateur acts on the show and immediately evaluate the performance. If the act was particularly bad, the TV host, Chuck Barris, would hit a large gong in the middle of the singer's screeching song or the tuba player's tortured notes. Then he'd go on the stage and pull the performer off with a large sheepherder-type hook. Clearly, the show employed actors to be very bad in whatever they did. Sometimes the performance was excellent, which caused the audience to be in suspense as to the quality of the next act. Sometimes, between musical performances, the unknown comic would appear with a brown paper bag over his head and look into the camera through his 2 eye holes, while proceeding to tell dumb jokes that accompanied his strange arm and leg movements. Those movements were supposed to be complicated dance moves. Naturally, the gong would ring and the unknown comic would be dragged off. The very bizarreness of the show produced laughs. The one constant of the show was the unexpected appearance of the unknown comic. Somehow that show and the TV show titled Laugh-In were often topics of conversation among the cooperative school psychology providers. So, back to my pretending to be the unknown comic. It took all of my attention to keep the car centered in the fast lane of the divided 4-lane highway while picking up an old brown paper bag off the floor of the passenger side of the car, tear eye holes in it, and then place it over my head while maintaining a steady rate of speed. With all of that going on, I didn't dare try to determine if John knew I was approaching him, on the fast lane side. Fortunately, my car and John's car were the only two within close distance on this section of the road, or I wouldn't have been able to attempt to pull this off. At last, the paper bag was on my head, and I had enough vision out of the torn eye sockets to maneuver the car beside John's. I looked over to John in his driver's seat just as he looked over at me. Both of us had brown paper bags over our heads. We were twins. We were the unknown comic twins. Neither one of us had realized that the other one was preparing to surprise the other with this stunt. Naturally, we shared this story at staff meetings and in other social gatherings. It's been retold many times. Just a few months ago, John and I shared it with Barry once again. Another spontaneously humorous event took place with a graduate assistant named John Johnson. Having two graduate assistants with the same first name, John, was sometimes confusing to those who called the co-op asking for John. John Johnson and I were going to visit a banker that managed the cooperative's banking account. We entered an elevator on the ground floor of the bank. It was fairly crowded with well-dressed businessmen holding expensive briefcases. The two of us were the last to enter the elevator. As we turned to face the elevator's closing door, John's hand moved forward to push a floor selection button, just as several of the businessmen did the same. Everyone seemed to realize what was happening at the same time. All the extended hands froze in midair, not knowing what to do. In that silent but awkward moment, words shot out of my mouth as I nodded my head toward John. "I'm his psychologist. Don't let him push the button. He will compulsively start pushing all the buttons. We'll be stuck in here. Quickly, someone else push it." With only the sound of but I coming from John's lips, a businessman's hand shot forward. He pushed a button. In total silence, except for the sputtering of John, we rose 2 floors. The doors opened. The businessmen quickly disappeared down various hallways. Not a word had been spoken. Chuckling, John and I chewed on the dynamics of that interaction. We shared the story with the co-op staff. John had the opportunity to reverse roles on me at a large conference and subsequent banquet. The banquet was the last event of a conference honoring both those with disabilities and the professionals who served them. The banquet was held in the National Convention Center. There appeared to be hundreds of people sitting in long rows of tables that ran the length of the convention floor. Unfortunately, John and I sat near the end of one of the long rows. We were among the last to be served. The food was being served as many famous performers from the Grand Ole Opry performed. Our food arrived cold. Several of the seriously disabled attendees experienced medical emergencies during the meal and performances. They were removed in dramatic fashion by attending caregivers, with high school students serving us. They continued to place meals in front of people, and the performers continued to entertain the remaining hundreds. It appeared to be a little chaotic. Minnie Pearl was there with her famous hat dangling its attached price tag. She began by stating that she felt quite comfortable being with so many disabled people, as she was disabled herself. She had no talent. Her attempt at humor was poorly received, as the last 7 or more performers before her had used the same line. As time wore on, all I wanted was to receive a cup of hot coffee and the banquet to be declared over. It was a long drive back to Knoxville. John and I would have to start tomorrow's workday at 8 a.m. At last, I saw the young waitress moving from the end of our table towards us, pouring coffee from a carafe. Several times I communicated my joy that hot coffee was coming. At last she was pouring John some coffee. I was next. John spoke to her so quietly that I could not hear him thank her. She nodded her head and smiled as he spoke. Then she briskly walked right past me on at the table. She didn't give me my coffee. I called out to her, holding up my cup. She looked at me in alarm, shook her head, and walked away. John broke into laughter as I exclaimed, "What did you say to her?" "I told her that I was your attending psychologist, that she was not to give you any coffee, no matter how much you ask her for some. Caffeine produced hallucinatory events in you that were as dramatic as they were strange. That's all." It took a moment for me to see the humor in the situation, but I did. Over time, I have learned to be a little more restrained in my spontaneous attempts to share my humorous take on events around me.